in the grand library of Harrow Manor, a glittering literary salon turns deadly when Clara Wren, a rising novelist, collapses after a fateful toast poisoned by cyanide. Amidst the elegance of chandeliers and whispered rivalries, Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of envy and secrets. A vicious critic, a brooding writer, a desperate hostess, each hides a motive, but only one holds the key to murder. As clues emerge, a monogrammed napkin, a hidden memoir, the truth lies in the shadows of ambition, who silenced Clara before her secrets could speak. Chapter 1. The Invitation in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the seasons turned with predictable grace, and the gossip flowed as steadily as the brook. Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest drawing-room, her knitting needles moving with the rhythmic precision of a metronome. The afternoon sun filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where a single letter lay, its cream-coloured envelope pristine against the wood. The envelope bore a wax seal, embossed with an elegant H, and the address was penned in a hand so refined it seemed to belong to another era. Miss Marple, with her usual care, slit it open and unfolded the contents, her pale blue eyes scanning the words with quiet curiosity. The letter was an invitation from Lady Beatrice Harrow, a woman whose name carried weight in certain literary circles. She was known for her salons at Harrow Manor, gatherings that drew writers, critics, and thinkers from London and beyond. The event promised an evening of stimulating discourse, with a guest list that piqued Miss Marple's interest. Victor Crane, a novelist whose brooding historical sagas had won him acclaim. Edmund Slate, a critic whose sharp pen was as feared as it was respected. And Clara Wren, a newcomer to the literary scene whose wit was said to cut as keenly as her prose. The invitation extended to Miss Marple herself, a nod to her reputation for insightful conversation, though she suspected Lady Beatrice valued her presence more for her knack of observing the unspoken. Miss Marple set the letter down, her fingers pausing over the soft wool in her lap. She was no stranger to such gatherings, having attended a few in her younger days, when London's literary set had occasionally sought her out for her quiet wisdom. But Harrow Manor was a good distance from St. Mary Mead, and the journey would require effort. She considered declining, picturing her garden, where the roses needed pruning and the chrysanthemums were just beginning to bud. Yet something in the invitation stirred her. The names Crane, Slate, Wren carried a faint echo of discord, like notes in a melody that clashed rather than harmonized. She had read of Victor Crane's recent feud with a rival author, and Edmund Slate's latest review had been particularly venomous, targeting a young writer with a vehemence that seemed personal. As for Clara, Wren, her name was unfamiliar, but Miss Marple had heard whispers of a new talent whose work had set tongues wagging. She rose, crossing to the window to gaze at the village green, where children played, and Mrs. Price from the post office hurried past with a parcel. St. Mary Mead was peaceful, its scandals small and familiar, but Miss Marple's mind was drawn to the complexities of human nature, which she knew could fester in any setting, even one as grand as Harrow Manor. She returned to her chair, picking up the invitation once more. Lady Beatrice had written with warmth, expressing hope that Miss Marple's presence would lend a certain clarity to the evening. The phrase amused her. Clarity, she knew, often came at the cost of exposing truths others preferred to keep hidden. As she penned her acceptance, her thoughts drifted to the guests. Victor Crane, she recalled, was a man of charm, but rumoured to guard his reputation fiercely. Edmund Slate's critiques, while brilliant, often carried a cruelty that suggested more than professional judgment. And Clara Wren, Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire about her at the village library, where Miss Hartnell, an avid reader, might have insights. The knitting needles resumed their dance, and Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. She would attend the salon, not merely for the promise of literary discussion, but because her instincts, honed by years of observing the quiet dramas of village life, told her that where egos and ambitions converged, trouble was seldom far behind. Chapter 2. The gathering Harrow Manor stood at the edge of a windswept hill, its grey stone facade softened by the golden hues of an autumn evening. The manor's tall windows glowed with the promise of warmth, and as Miss Jane Marple stepped from the hired car, she felt the crisp air bite at her cheeks. Her black shawl, pinned neatly at the shoulder, fluttered as she ascended the steps, her small, precise movements belying the keen observation in her pale blue eyes. The heavy oak door swung open, revealing a butler whose stiff posture and impeccable livery suggested a household run with meticulous care. He took her coat and ushered her into the grand hall, where the scent of beeswax polish mingled with the faint musk of old books. The library, where the literary salon was to take place, was a splendid room, its high ceilings adorned with intricate plasterwork, and its walls lined with shelves that groaned under the weight of leather-bound volumes. A fire crackled in the immense hearth, casting flickering shadows across the polished floor. Chandeliers hung above, their crystal prisms scattering light like stars, illuminating the gathered guests who milled about with glasses in hand. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, her modest figure almost lost in the grandeur, and took in the scene with the quiet attentiveness of one accustomed to noticing what others overlooked. Lady Beatrice Harrow, the hostess, stood near the centre of the room, her sapphire silk gown shimmering as she greeted her guests with a radiant smile. Her auburn hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, and her gestures were those of a woman who knew the power of her charm. She was perhaps 40, though her poise made her age difficult to discern, and her voice carried the warm, practised cadence of a seasoned conversationalist. "Miss Marple, how delightful you could come!" she exclaimed, gliding forward to take her guest's hand. "I've heard such tales of your insight. I do hope you'll find our little gathering stimulating." Miss Marple returned a polite smile, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "You're most kind, Lady Beatrice. I'm sure the evening will be quite illuminating." Her words were gentle, but there was a flicker in her gaze as she noted the faint strain in Lady Beatrice's expression, a tightness around the eyes that suggested more than the usual hostly nerves. The room was alive with the hum of conversation, a tapestry of voices weaving through discussions of literature, politics, and the occasional barb disguised as wit. Miss Marple accepted a glass of sherry from a passing tray, her preference for it noted by the attentive butler, and found a seat in a high-backed chair near a corner, where she could observe without drawing attention. Her knitting, ever present, emerged from her bag, and the soft click of her needles provided a steady counterpoint to the room's chatter. Victor Crane, the celebrated novelist, stood by the hearth, his broad shoulders and dark hair giving him the air of a romantic hero from one of his own novels. He was in his late 30s, with a face that was handsome yet shadowed, as though he carried some private burden. He sipped brandy, his eyes scanning the room with a mix of confidence and wariness. Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened around his glass when a young poet approached, eager to discuss his latest work. Victor's smile was charming, but his responses were clipped, as though he wished to be elsewhere. Edmund Slate, the critic, was a stark contrast. Thin and angular, with a face like a hawk's and eyes that gleamed with a predatory sharpness, he stood near a bookcase, a glass of red wine in hand. His suit was immaculate, but there was something austere about him, a severity that seemed to repel rather than invite conversation. He was speaking to a middle-aged woman who nodded vigorously at his pronouncements, though Miss Marple suspected she understood little of his biting commentary on modern literature. Slate's voice carried a nasal edge, and his words were laced with a disdain that made Miss Marple's needles pause momentarily. She recalled a recent article of his, a scathing review that had left a young author's reputation in tatters. There was, she thought, a cruelty in his precision that went beyond professional duty. Clara Wren, the final figure of note, was a study in quiet elegance. She was younger than Miss Marple had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with a delicate frame and dark hair, pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. Her dress, a deep emerald green, was simple yet striking, and her movements were graceful, as she engaged in conversation with a small group near the windows. Her voice was low, but there was a spark in her eyes, a quickness that suggested a mind as sharp as her reputed wit. Miss Marple watched as Clara deflected a question from a pompous gentleman with a quip that drew laughter, though the man himself flushed with embarrassment. Clara's charm, it seemed, could cut as well as captivate. The other guests were a mix of literary hopefuls, local gentry, and a few academics. Their conversations a blend of earnest debate and calculated flattery. A young poet, flushed with enthusiasm, recited lines from his latest work to a bored-looking couple. A professor from Oxford held forth on the merits of the Romantic poets, while a woman in a feathered hat nodded absently, her eyes fixed on Victor Crane. Miss Marple's gaze moved from one to another, cataloguing their interactions with the precision of a naturalist studying a new species. She had always found that people, like her roses, revealed their true natures in the smallest details. The tilt of a head, the tightening of a jaw, the way a hand lingered too long on a glass. Lady Beatrice clapped her hands, drawing the room's attention. "My dear friends," she began, her voice carrying effortlessly. "Tonight, we gather to celebrate the power of the written word, to explore its beauty and its challenges. I've asked each of our distinguished guests to share a thought or two on the state of literature today. Let us begin with Mr. Crane, whose novels have so captivated our imaginations." Victor Crane stepped forward, his smile practiced but not insincere. "I'm honored," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "Literature, I believe, is a mirror to the soul. It must reflect truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. But it must also entertain, for what is a story without pleasure?" His words were met with murmurs of approval, though Miss Marple noted Edmund Slate's slight sneer, as though he found the sentiment trite. Slate was next, and his voice cut through the room like a blade. "Literature," he declared, "is not a mirror but a scalpel. It dissects, it exposes, it demands rigour. Too much of what passes for writing today is mere sentimentality, pandering to the masses." His eyes flicked toward Victor, and Miss Marple caught the brief tightening of Victor's jaw, a flash of resentment quickly masked. Clara Wren spoke last, her tone light but deliberate. "I think literature is a conversation," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "It speaks to the reader, but it also listens, drawing out their own thoughts and fears. A good book doesn't just tell a story, it invites the reader to tell their own." Her words were met with enthusiastic applause, though Miss Marple noticed Slate's expression darken, his lips thinning as he sipped his wine. The evening progressed with readings and debates, the atmosphere charged with the interplay of egos. Miss Marple listened, her needles moving steadily, as the conversation turned to more contentious topics. A young writer mentioned Clara's recent novel, praising its bold style, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in Victor's eyes. Slate, meanwhile, made a pointed remark about derivative works that seemed aimed at Clara, who responded with a smile so sharp it could have drawn blood. Lady Beatrice, ever the diplomat, steered the discussion to safer ground, but Miss Marple sensed the undercurrents of rivalry and resentment that simmered beneath the surface. As the hour grew late, the butler circulated with a tray of drinks for a final toast. Lady Beatrice raised her glass, her voice warm with conviction. "To literature," she said, "and to the minds that shape it." The guests echoed her, their glasses glinting in the firelight. Miss Marple raised her sherry, her eyes darting to the others. Victor's guarded expression, Slate's cold detachment, Clara's poised smile. She sipped sparingly, her habit of caution as ingrained as her knitting. It was then that the evening took its fatal turn. Clara Wren, standing near the window, suddenly gasped, her glass slipping from her fingers to shatter on the floor. Her hand flew to her throat, her face contorting in agony. She staggered, her emerald dress catching the light as she fell, crumpling to the ground in a lifeless heap. The room froze, the silence broken only by a woman's stifled scream. Lady Beatrice dropped her glass, her face ashen, while Victor rushed forward, kneeling beside Clara. Slate remained by the bookcase, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her heart quickening though her demeanour remained calm. She rose, moving closer to the fallen woman, her eyes scanning the scene. A faint, bitter scent hung in the air, almost imperceptible but unmistakable to one who knew it. She glanced at the shattered glass, its contents seeping into the rug, and then at the faces of the guests, shock, fear, and something else, something guarded, in more than one pair of eyes. Lady Beatrice's voice trembled as she called for the butler to fetch a doctor. "Is she—" she began, unable to finish. A guest, a physician by trade, stepped forward, his fingers seeking a pulse. After a moment, he looked up, his face grim. "She's gone," he said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the sideboard where the drinks had been poured, then moved to the guests, each frozen in their own tableau of shock or calculation. Her mind sharp as ever, began to sift through the details, the sense, the timing, the subtle shifts in expression she had observed all evening. Something had happened in this room, something deliberate and dark, and she knew, with the certainty of long experience, that the truth lay hidden in the interplay of these glittering, ambitious souls. As the guests murmured, and the butler hurried to summon the authorities, Miss Marple returned to her chair. Her knitting resumed with deceptive calm. The salon, meant to celebrate the written word, had become a stage for a far graver drama, and she, unassuming and unnoticed, was already beginning to unravel its threads. Chapter 3. The Fatal Toast. The library at Harrow Manor, moments ago a haven of intellectual fervour, now lay under a pall of dread. The fire still crackled in the hearth, its warm glow at odds with the chill that had settled over the guests. Clara Wren's body lay near the window, her emerald dress fanned out like a fallen leaf, her face frozen in a grimace of pain. The shattered remnants of her glass glittered on the rug, catching the chandelier's light. Miss Jane Marple stood quietly to one side, her small figure almost lost among the taller guests, her pale eyes moving from face to face with the precision of a watchmaker. Her knitting lay forgotten in her chair, for the moment demanded her full attention. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her composure fraying, clutched a handkerchief as she hovered near the physician, Dr. Langley, who knelt beside Clara. His examination was brief but thorough, his fingers probing for signs of life that were clearly absent. He rose, brushing his knees, and addressed the room in a low, steady voice. "She's been dead only moments," he said. "The cause is not as yet clear, but the suddenness suggests something unnatural." His hesitation hung in the air, and a murmur rippled through the guests, a mix of shock and suspicion. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the broken glass, noting the faint, acrid scent that lingered above it. A bitter almond note, subtle but unmistakable to one familiar with such things. She had encountered it once before, years ago, in a case involving a jilted suitor and a bottle of liqueur. Cyanide, she thought, though she kept the observation to herself. Her eyes flicked to the sideboard where the drinks had been poured, its polished surface cluttered with decanters and glasses. And then to the guests, each reacting in their own way to the tragedy unfolding before them. Victor Crane, the novelist, stood closest to Clara, his face pale but composed. He had been the first to reach her, his hands hovering helplessly as though he might somehow undo what had happened. Now he stepped back, his dark eyes clouded with something Miss Marple could not quite place. Grief, perhaps, or guilt. His hands, she noticed, were steady, but he twisted the heavy signet ring on his finger, a gesture that betrayed unease. Edmund Slate, the critic, remained by the bookcase, his thin frame rigid, his wine-glass still in hand. His expression was one of cold detachment, as though the scene were a distasteful interruption to the evening's proceedings. Yet Miss Marple observed the slight tremor in his fingers, the way his eyes darted toward the sideboard before returning to the floor. He had not moved to assist, nor had he spoken since Clara's collapse, and his silence, she thought, was as telling as any outburst. Lady Beatrice, her voice trembling, addressed the room. "This is dreadful, simply dreadful. We must call the police at once. Oh, poor Clara!" She turned to the butler, who stood pale and rigid by the door. "Jenkins, fetch the telephone. and ensure no one leaves this room until we know what's happened." Her tone, though shaken, carried the authority of her station, and Jenkins nodded, disappearing into the hall. The guests, a mix of literary hopefuls and local gentry, stood in clusters, their earlier vivacity replaced by unease. The young poet, who had earlier recited his verses with such enthusiasm, now looked ashen, his hands clasped tightly before him. The professor from Oxford, his earlier pomposity deflated, muttered something about a terrible accident. The woman in the feathered hat, who had been so intent on Victor Crane, now wept quietly into a lace handkerchief. Miss Marple noted each reaction, her mind cataloguing the subtle shifts in posture and expression that often revealed more than words. She stepped closer to the sideboard, her movements unobtrusive, and examined the array of glasses and decanters. The tray from which the toast glasses had been distributed was still there, half empty. The remaining drinks untouched. She leaned slightly forward, her nose catching that faint telltale scent again, though it was fainter here, diluted by the mingled aromas of brandy, wine, and sherry. Her own glass of sherry, untouched save for a single sip, sat on a small table near her chair, and she was grateful for her habit of moderation. The poison, she suspected, had been in Clara's glass alone, but how it had been administered, and by whom, was a puzzle yet to be solved. The sound of heavy footsteps announced the arrival of Inspector Harroway, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanour. He entered the library with 2 constables in tow, his eyes sweeping the room with the practised efficiency of one accustomed to calamity. Lady Beatrice hurried to him, her words tumbling out in a rush as she explained the evening's events and Clara's sudden collapse. The inspector listened, his expression impassive, then turned to Dr. Langley for confirmation. "Cyanide, most likely," the doctor said quietly, meeting the inspector's gaze. "The symptoms, convulsions, rapid collapse, and that faint almond-like smell, are characteristic. I'd need a post-mortem to be certain, but I've seen it before." His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed a slight shake as he gestured toward the broken glass. Inspector Harroway nodded, his jaw tightening. "Right. No one leaves this room until we've had a proper look. Constable Reed, secure the sideboard and collect the glasses. Carefully, mind you." He turned to the guests, his voice firm. "I'll need statements from everyone. Names, your connection to the deceased, and exactly what you saw before she collapsed. Let's start with you, Lady Beatrice." Miss Marple, still near the sideboard, watched as the inspector began his inquiries. Lady Beatrice, regaining some of her poise, recounted the evening's events, the readings, the debates, the toast. "It was all so civilized," she said, her voice catching. "And then this." She gestured helplessly toward Clara's body, now covered with a shawl brought by one of the maids. Victor Crane was next, his account delivered with the polish of a man used to crafting narratives. "I was standing near the hearth," he said, his voice low but clear. "We'd just finished the toast when Clara gasped and fell. I tried to help, but it was too late." His eyes met the inspector's, steady but guarded, and Miss Marple noted the way he avoided looking at Clara's body. Edmund Slate's statement was curt, almost dismissive. "I was by the bookcase, as I had been all evening," he said, his tone clipped. "I saw nothing out of the ordinary until she collapsed. A tragedy, no doubt, but I've nothing to add." His eyes flicked briefly to Miss Marple, and she sensed a wariness in him as though he knew she was watching more closely than most. The other guests offered similar accounts, their stories overlapping in a chorus of shock and confusion. No one, it seemed, had seen anything unusual before the toast, though the young poet mentioned that Clara had seemed a bit tense during the evening, as though something weighed on her mind. Miss Marple filed this away, along with the professor's offhand remark that Clara's recent novel had stirred up quite a fuss in literary circles. As the inspector continued his questioning, Miss Marple returned to her chair, retrieving her knitting but keeping her hands still. Her mind was at work, piecing together the fragments of the evening. The toast had been the pivotal moment, the poison delivered in that brief window when glasses were raised. But who had the opportunity, and more importantly, the motive? Clara Wren, she recalled, was a rising star, her work bold and provocative. Such success, Miss Marple knew from her years in St. Mary Mead, often bred envy. And envy could be a dangerous thing. She glanced at Victor Crane, whose rivalry with Clara was no secret, his traditional novels overshadowed by her innovative style. Then there was Edmund Slate, whose scathing reviews had targeted Clara with particular venom. And Lady Beatrice, for all her charm, had a stake in the success of her salon, which Clara's presence, and now her death, had dramatically altered. Even the lesser guests with their own ambitions and grudges could not be dismissed. Inspector Harraway, having finished his initial round of questions, instructed the constables to seal the library and preserve the scene. "We'll need to test the glasses and the decanters," he said, his voice gruff. "And I'll want a word with the staff who handle the drinks. No one's to touch anything until we've got answers." He turned to Lady Beatrice. "Is there a room where the guests can wait? This may take some time." Lady Beatrice nodded, her face pale but composed. "The drawing-room, Inspector. Jenkins will show you." She gestured to the butler, who led the guests out, their footsteps heavy with reluctance. Miss Marple lingered a moment, her eyes sweeping the room one last time. The sideboard, the broken glass, the faint scent of almonds. It was a puzzle, and she felt the familiar stir of curiosity that had so often led her to the truth. As she followed the others to the drawing-room, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the human heart. So often the source of both beauty and darkness. Clara Wren's death was no accident. Of that she was certain. And in the intricate dance of motives and opportunities that had played out in this grand library, she would find the steps that led to murder. Chapter 4. The Inspector Arrives. The drawing-room of Harrow Manor, where the guests had been ushered after the tragedy in the library, was a study in contrasts to the scene they had left behind. Its soft furnishings, plush velvet chairs, embroidered cushions, and a rosewood table adorned with a vase of late dahlias, offered a semblance of comfort, yet the air was thick with unease. The fire in the grate burned low, casting long shadows that danced across the faces of the gathered company. Miss Jane Marple sat near a window, her small frame nestled in an armchair, her knitting resumed but her needles moving slowly, as if her true focus lay elsewhere. Her pale eyes, sharp and unclouded despite her years, took in every detail of the room and its occupants, alert to the currents of fear and suspicion that rippled beneath their strained politeness. Inspector Harraway's arrival had brought a shift in the atmosphere. his solid presence a reminder that Clara Wren's death was no mere accident, but a matter for the law. He stood in the centre of the room, his broad shoulders squared, his notebook open, and his pencil poised with the deliberation of a man who trusted facts over feelings. His weathered face, lined from years of dealing with human folly, betrayed no emotion as he addressed the guests. "I'll need your cooperation," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "No one leaves the manor until we've got a clear picture of what happened. My men are securing the library, and we'll be speaking to each of you in turn." Lady Beatrice Harrow, seated on a settee with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, nodded, though her eyes were red-rimmed. "Of course, Inspector," she said, her voice steady but thin. "Anything we can do to help. This is unthinkable." Her gaze drifted toward the door, as though she could still see Clara's body lying in the library. And Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her fingers, a sign of strain beneath her polished exterior. The inspector's questions began with the staff, who were summoned one by one from their duties. Jenkins, the butler, was first, his formal demeanour unshaken despite the circumstances. He confirmed that he had overseen the preparation of the drinks, pouring them from decanters kept in the library's sideboard. "I filled the glasses myself, sir," he said, his voice measured. "Brandy, wine, sherry, all as requested by her ladyship." I noticed nothing amiss. When pressed about who had access to the sideboard, he hesitated, then admitted that the room had been busy, with guests milling about before the toast. "It's possible someone approached the tray, but I was attending to other duties," he said, his tone apologetic but firm. Miss Marple, listening from her corner, noted the butler's precision, but also his slight discomfort when mentioning the sideboard. She wondered if he felt responsible, or if there was something he had seen but not yet recognized as significant. Her needles clicked softly, a rhythm that seemed to steady her thoughts as she pieced together the evening's events. The inspector moved on to the guests, starting with Victor Crane, who had returned to his position by the fire, his brandy glass now replaced with a cup of tea brought by a maid. His account was much as he had given before, delivered with the same polished ease, but Miss Marple detected a new edge to his voice, a wariness that had not been there earlier. "I was reciting a passage from my latest work when the toast was proposed," he said. "I took a glass like everyone else and drank. Clara was across the room. I didn't see her until she fell." His fingers, she noticed, were still twisting that signet ring, a habit that seemed to surface when he was under scrutiny. Edmund Slate was less forthcoming, his answers clipped and tinged with impatience. "I was by the bookcase, as I said," he told the inspector, his hawk-like features sharp in the firelight. "I took a glass of wine, drank to the toast, and saw nothing unusual until the commotion began. This is a waste of time. I've no insight to offer." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the way his eyes flicked toward the door, as though he longed to escape the room's confines. She wondered if his brusqueness was a shield, concealing something he preferred to keep hidden. Lady Beatrice, when questioned, provided a detailed account of the evening's structure, the readings, the debates, the toast. "It was meant to be a celebration," she said, her voice catching. "Clara was so vibrant, so full of promise. I can't imagine who would do such a thing." Her distress seemed genuine, but Miss Marple noted the way she avoided mentioning any tensions among the guests, as though determined to preserve the illusion of harmony. The other guests offered little new information, their accounts a blend of shock and vague recollections. The young poet, still shaken, stammered through his statement, mentioning only that he had been near Clara during the toast, and had noticed her smile falter briefly before she drank. The professor, his earlier verbosity subdued, spoke of Clara's rising star in literary circles, hinting at rivalries but offering no names. The woman in the feathered hat, now composed, claimed to have been too engrossed in conversation to notice anything amiss. Miss Marple, though not questioned directly, listened with rapt attention, her mind sifting through the details like a gardener turning soil. The sideboard, she thought, was the key. The poison had been in Clara's glass, and the opportunity to tamper with it must have come in the moments before the toast, when the room was alive with movement. She recalled the layout of the library, the sideboard near the window, partially screened by a tall fern, and the guests' comings and goings as they mingled. Someone, she reasoned, had slipped something into Clara's glass, but it would have required both nerve and precision to do so, unnoticed. As the inspector concluded his initial interviews, he turned to Dr. Langley, who had remained in the drawing-room, his medical bag at his side. "You're certain about the cyanide?" Harroway asked, his tone gruff but respectful. The doctor nodded. "As certain as I can be without a laboratory. The symptoms are textbook. Rapid onset, convulsions, that faint almond-like smell. I'd wager it was a concentrated dose, likely in the wine she drank." He hesitated, then added, "It's not something you'd find lying about." Whoever did this knew what they were doing. The inspector's eyes narrowed. And the glass. Only hers was affected. "So it seems," Dr. Langley replied. "No one else has shown symptoms, and the other glasses appear untouched. I'd recommend testing them all, though, to be sure." Harroway nodded, making a note. "We'll send everything to the lab. In the meantime, I want a list of everyone who was near that sideboard before the toast. And I'll need to speak to the kitchen staff, find out where those decanters were filled." Miss Marple, her knitting now a mere prop, considered the implications. Cyanide was not a casual poison. It required intent, access, and knowledge. She thought of the guests, each with their own reasons to resent Clara's success. Victor Crane, whose star was waning as hers rose. Edmund Slate, whose career might be threatened by her rumoured memoir. Even Lady Beatrice, whose salon depended on its reputation, might have feared Clara's growing influence, or the secrets she might reveal. And then there were the others, the lesser players, whose motives might be less obvious but no less potent. The inspector moved to confer with his constables. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate, and approached the sideboard, now cordoned off by a constable. She did not touch anything, merely stood a moment, her eyes tracing the arrangement of glasses and decanters. The tray, she noted, had been crowded, with glasses placed close together. It would have been a simple matter in the bustle of the evening for a hand to slip something into one glass while reaching for another. But whose hand? She returned to her seat, her mind turning to Clara herself. The young woman had been a force, her wit and talent a magnet for both admiration and envy. Miss Marple recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead. where a young actress's rise had sparked jealousy among her peers, leading to a tragic end. People, she knew, could be remarkably predictable in their flaws, no matter the setting. The inspector, having finished his consultation, addressed the room once more. "We'll need to keep you here a bit longer," he said. "I'll be taking statements in the study, one at a time. Lady Beatrice, if you could arrange for some tea and sandwiches, it might help settle everyone's nerves." Lady Beatrice nodded, summoning Jenkins with a gesture. As the guests settled into an uneasy wait, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles moving with renewed purpose. The puzzle was taking shape, its pieces scattered but not beyond reach. Clara Wren's death was a crime of calculation, and somewhere in the interplay of ambition, fear, and hidden grudges, the truth waited to be uncovered. For now, she would watch and listen, knowing that the smallest slip, a word, a glance, a gesture, could lead her to the heart of the matter. Chapter 5. Whispers of Envy. The drawing room at Harrow Manor, with its soft lamplight and delicate furnishings, seemed to close in around the guests as the night wore on, the air heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Miss Jane Marple sat in her corner, her knitting needles moving with a quiet rhythm that belied the sharpness of her thoughts. The inspector's interviews had adjourned to the study, leaving the guests in a state of restless waiting, their earlier poise eroded by the reality of Clara Wren's death. The low hum of conversation was punctuated by nervous glances, as though each person feared what the others might know or suspect. Miss Marple, ever the observer, used the lull to her advantage. She had a way of blending into the background, her modest demeanour and gentle manner disarming those who might otherwise guard their words. With her knitting as a prop, she moved among the guests, offering a sympathetic smile or a murmured condolence, her ears attuned to the fragments of gossip that floated like dust motes in the air. It was in such moments, she knew, that truths slipped out, often cloaked in casual remarks or unguarded asides. She approached the young poet, whose name, she had learned, was Arthur Pennington. He sat alone on a settee, his hands twisting a crumpled handkerchief, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by a pallor that made him look younger than his 20-odd years. "Such a dreadful thing," Miss Marple said softly, settling beside him with her knitting bag. "You must have known Miss Wren well, to speak so highly of her work earlier." Arthur started, his eyes wide. "Oh, not well, not really," he stammered. "I mean, I admired her. Everyone did. Her novel. It was so bold, so different. But she made enemies, you know." He glanced around as though fearful of being overheard, and lowered his voice. "Mr. Slate, the critic, he wrote a terrible review of her book, called it derivative drivel. I heard Clara was furious, said she'd make him regret it." Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. "Did she now?" she said, her tone mild but encouraging. "I suppose such strong words could stir up quite a bit of feeling." Arthur nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "They argued at a literary dinner in London last month. I wasn't there, but people talked. Clara said something about knowing things, secrets, you know, that could ruin him. I don't know what she meant, but it sounded serious." He hesitated, then added, "She wasn't afraid of anyone. That's what made her so remarkable." Miss Marple smiled, patting his hand. "You've a good memory, Mr. Pennington. It's a comfort to know Miss Wren had such admirers." She rose, leaving the young man to his thoughts, her mind turning over his words. A public argument, a threat of exposure. Clara Wren had not been one to shy away from confrontation, and that Miss Marple knew could be a dangerous trait. She drifted toward a small group near the fireplace, where the professor from Oxford, Dr. Mortimer, was holding court with a few others. His earlier pomposity had returned, though tempered by the evening's events, and he was expounding on the competitive nature of literary circles. "Clara Wren was a comet," he said, his voice resonant. "Brilliant, but bound to burn out or crash. She was stepping on toes, you see, challenging the old guard. Not everyone takes kindly to that." Miss Marple, pausing nearby as though adjusting her shawl, tilted her head. "A comet, you say? That's a vivid image, Doctor. Mortimer. Did she challenge anyone in particular, do you think?" The professor blinked, surprised to find her there, but answered readily enough. "Oh, she ruffled feathers everywhere. Victor Crane, for one. He's been the darling of historical fiction for years, but Clara's modern style was stealing his thunder. And Slate, of course, his reviews were vicious, but I suspect she gave as good as she got." He chuckled, then caught himself, his face sobering. "Poor girl, such a waste." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle sympathy, but her mind was racing. Envy, she thought, was a powerful force, one she had seen at work in St. Mary Mead as surely as in grand manners like this one. She recalled a village dressmaker, whose success had sparked such jealousy among her peers that it led to sabotage and spite. Clara's rise, it seemed, had stirred similar passions, and the question was whose resentment had turned deadly. She moved on, pausing near the woman in the feathered hat, whose name, she had gleaned, was Mrs. Lavinia Gray. The woman was speaking in hushed tones to another guest, a local squire with a florid complexion. Clara was too bold, Mrs. Gray was saying, her voice tinged with disapproval. Always stirring things up. I heard she was writing a memoir, full of scandal, they say. No wonder someone wanted her gone. Miss Marple's ears pricked at this, though she kept her gaze on her knitting. "A memoir, you say?" she murmured, as though to herself, but loud enough for Mrs. Gray to hear. "That sounds rather intriguing." Mrs. Gray turned, her feathers bobbing. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple, is it?" "Quite the talk in London. They say Clara was going to name names, expose all sorts of secrets. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what got her into trouble." She leaned closer, her voice dropping. "I saw her talking to Mr. Slate earlier this evening, and it didn't look friendly. She was pointing at him, almost accusingly." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "How very interesting," she said, her tone as mild as ever. "It's curious how words can cause such a stir, isn't it?" She excused herself, her mind turning over this new piece of the puzzle. A memoir, threatening to expose secrets, could provide a motive for murder, particularly for someone like Edmund Slate, whose career depended on his reputation. She glanced across the room at Slate, who stood alone by a window, his thin frame silhouetted against the dark glass. His earlier detachment had given way to a restlessness, his fingers tapping against his thigh. Miss Marple wondered what secrets Clara might have uncovered. Something from his past, perhaps, that could undo his carefully crafted image as a critic of unimpeachable judgment. Victor Crane, meanwhile, was engaged in conversation with Lady Beatrice, his charm reasserting itself as he offered her a reassuring smile. But Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted toward the door where Inspector Harroway had disappeared, as though he were calculating his next move. Lady Beatrice, for her part, seemed to draw strength from his presence, though her hands still clutched her handkerchief tightly. Miss Marple returned to her chair, settling in with her knitting, her thoughts weaving together the threads of what she had heard. Clara Wren had been a threat, not just to egos, but to reputations, perhaps even livelihoods. The memoir, the argument with Slate, the rivalry with Crane, all pointed to a web of motives that centered on her. But motives alone were not enough. There was the matter of opportunity, and the sideboard, with its crowded tray of glasses, remained the focal point. She recalled the moments before the toast, the flurry of movement as guests mingled, and the butler distributed drinks. It would have taken only a second, she thought, for a practiced hand to slip something into Clara's glass. The fern by the sideboard, she remembered, had partially obscured the tray from view, offering a moment of privacy for the act. But who had been near enough and bold enough to seize that moment? As the inspector re-entered the room, his expression grim, Miss Marple's needles paused. He addressed the group, his voice cutting through the low murmur. "We've secured the library and collected the glasses for testing," he said. "I'll need to speak to a few of you again, starting with Mr. Jenkins. The rest of you stay here and try to remain calm." Miss Marple watched as the butler followed the inspector out, her mind still turning over the puzzle. Envy, ambition, fear, these were the currents that ran through Harrow Manor tonight, and Clara Wren had been caught in their undertow. As she resumed her knitting, her thoughts were not on the stitches, but on the human frailties she had seen so often before. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that even the smallest village could hide great darkness, and here, in this grand house, she sensed a darkness no less profound. The truth, she was certain, was close at hand, waiting to be drawn out like a thread from the tangle of this tragic evening. Chapter 6. The Host's Secret. The morning after Clara Wren's death dawned grey and heavy, the clouds over Harrow Manor mirroring the sombre mood within its walls. The guests confined to the manor by Inspector Harroway's orders had been given rooms for the night, and now they gathered in the dining room for a subdued breakfast. The long mahogany table, set with fine china and silver, seemed almost mocking in its elegance, given the grim circumstances. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the end of the table, sipped her tea with quiet deliberation, her eyes moving over the assembled company. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, a silent companion, but her needles remained untouched, her attention wholly given to the subtle dynamics of the room. Lady Beatrice Harrow presided over the meal with a strained grace, her sapphire gown replaced by a sombre grey dress that did little to conceal the pallor of her face. She made valiant efforts to maintain conversation, commenting on the weather and the quality of the scones. But her words fell flat, met with polite murmurs or silence. Victor Crane, seated opposite Miss Marple, ate sparingly, his brooding gaze fixed on his plate, though his fingers toyed restlessly with his napkin. Edmund Slate, at the far end of the table, was a study in aloofness, his thin lips pressed into a line as he picked at a slice of toast. The other guests, Arthur Pennington, Dr. Mortimer, Mrs. Lavinia Gray, and the local, Squire sat in uneasy quiet, their appetites dulled by the shadow of the previous night. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human behaviour, noted the tension that hung over the table like a fog. She had spent the early hours of the morning reflecting on the fragments of information she had gathered, the whispers of Clara's memoir, the enmity between her and Slate, the professional rivalry with Crane. But it was Lady Beatrice who now drew her attention. The hostess's efforts to appear composed were admirable, yet there was a brittleness to her manner, a flicker of anxiety in her eyes that suggested more than mere distress over a guest's death. As the meal concluded, Lady Beatrice rose, smoothing her dress with a nervous gesture. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice warm but tinged with urgency, "might I have a word with you in private? I'd value your thoughts on this dreadful business." Her invitation was framed as a request, but Miss Marple sensed it was almost a plea, and she nodded, her expression one of gentle acquiescence. They retired to a small morning room, its walls adorned with delicate watercolour landscapes, and its windows overlooking a mist-shrouded garden. Lady Beatrice closed the door softly, then turned to Miss Marple, her hands clasped tightly before her. "I feel so helpless," she began, her voice low. "Clara's death, it's a stain on my home, on my salon. I've worked so hard to make these gatherings a beacon of culture, and now this." She sank into a chair, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Miss Marple settled opposite her, her hands folded in her lap, her demeanour one of quiet sympathy. "It's a terrible shock, Lady Beatrice," she said, "but you mustn't blame yourself. These things, dreadful as they are, often have roots far beyond our control." Her words were soothing, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any hint of what lay beneath the hostess's distress. Lady Beatrice leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I heard something, Miss Marple, something I can't shake. Clara was working on a memoir. Everyone's been talking about it. They say it was full of secrets, things that could ruin people. I didn't think much of it at first. Gossip is common in our circles, but last night, before the toast, I overheard her speaking to Edmund Slate." She paused, her fingers tightening around her handkerchief. "It was near the sideboard, during a lull in the conversation. Clara was angry. She said something about exposing the truth and how he'd pay for what he did. I couldn't hear everything, but it sounded like a threat." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was alight with interest. "How very curious," she said, her tone encouraging. "Did Mr. Slate respond?" Lady Beatrice nodded, her face pale. "He was cold, dismissive, but I saw his hand shake as he picked up his glass. He told her to mind her own business and walked away. I thought it was just a spat, but now I wonder if it meant more." She hesitated, then added, "I didn't tell the inspector. It seemed so trivial at the time, and I didn't want to make things worse for poor Edmund. He's been a fixture at my salons for years." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes kind but probing. "You've known Mr. Slate a long time, then?" "Oh, yes," Lady Beatrice said, a faint smile touching her lips. "He's been a friend since my early days in London. His reviews, sharp as they are, have always drawn attention to my gatherings. I owe him a great deal." Her voice wavered, and she looked down at her hands. But Clara, she was different. Her presence brought a new energy, a freshness. I thought she'd elevate the salon to new heights. And now I fear her death will ruin everything." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the delicate balance Lady Beatrice maintained. A salon's success depended on its reputation, on the allure of its guests and the prestige of its conversations. Clara's rising star had been a coup, but her death and the scandal it would bring could undo years of careful cultivation. She recalled a similar situation in St. Mary Mead, where a village fete had been marred by a petty theft, the fallout threatening the organizer's standing. Ambition, she knew, could breed desperation, even in the most refined settings. "You've built something remarkable here," Miss Marple said gently. "It's only natural to want to protect it. But tell me, did you notice anyone else near the sideboard before the toast? Someone who might have lingered, perhaps?" Lady Beatrice frowned, her brow furrowing as she thought back. "It's hard to say. The room was so crowded, and I was busy greeting guests. Jenkins was pouring the drinks, but he stepped away at one point to fetch more brandy. I suppose anyone could have approached the tray then." She paused, her eyes widening slightly. "Victor was nearby, I think. He was talking to Dr. Mortimer, just a few feet from the sideboard, and Edmund, of course, after his exchange with Clara. But I didn't see anything suspicious." Miss Marple's needles, now retrieved from her bag, began to move slowly. "How very helpful," she said. "It's often the smallest details that matter most." She paused, then added, "And Clara, did she seem herself earlier in the evening? Or was there anything unusual in her manner?" Lady Beatrice considered this, her fingers smoothing the folds of her dress. She was her usual self, witty, confident, a bit provocative. But there was a moment, just before the readings began, when she seemed distracted. She was looking at her glass, as though something about it puzzled her. "I thought she was just nervous about speaking, but now I wonder—" Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head. "It's probably nothing." Miss Marple's smile was reassuring, but her mind was cataloguing every word. A distracted glance at a glass, a heated exchange with Slate, the crowded sideboard. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though it was not yet clear. She thought of Clara's memoir, a document that seemed to loom over the case like a storm cloud. If it contained secrets, as the whispers suggested, it could have given any number of people a reason to silence her. "Thank you, Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple said, rising. "You've been most kind to share this with me. I'm sure the inspector will find the truth, and your salon will weather this storm." Her words were comforting, but her eyes held a glint of determination, for she knew that the truth was rarely found without a bit of prodding. As they returned to the dining room, where the guests were dispersing to their rooms or the drawing room, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the sideboard once more. The opportunity to poison Clara's glass had been fleeting, requiring both nerve and precision. Slate's argument with Clara placed him near the tray, and Victor's proximity, as Lady Beatrice had noted, could not be ignored. But Lady Beatrice herself, with her access to the household and her stake in the salon's success, was not above suspicion. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen how far people would go to protect their pride, and here, in this grand house, the stakes were higher still. She settled back into her chair in the drawing room, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The inspector would continue his inquiries, but Miss Marple knew that the heart of the matter lay in the human frailties she had observed: ambition, fear, and the secrets that bound them. Clara Wren's death was no random act, and as she knitted, she felt the threads of the mystery drawing tighter, ready to reveal the pattern beneath. Chapter 7. The Writer's Tale. The late morning light filtered through the tall windows of Harrow Manor's morning room, casting a pale glow over the polished furniture and the delicate watercolours on the walls. The air carried a faint chill, as though the house itself mourned the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a cushioned chair with her knitting bag at her side, had excused herself from the subdued gathering in the drawing-room to seek a moment of quiet reflection. Her needles moved with their usual rhythm, but her thoughts were far from the soft wool in her hands. Clara Wren's death, confirmed as cyanide poisoning by the inspector's preliminary findings, was a puzzle that demanded careful unravelling, and Miss Marple knew that the key lay in understanding the people who had surrounded her that fateful evening. Her conversation with Lady Beatrice had added new threads to the tapestry of the case: Clara's memoir, her heated exchange with Edmund Slate, the crowded sideboard where the poison had been slipped into her glass. Yet Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing the quiet dramas of St. Mary Mead, told her that motives were often layered, hidden beneath polished surfaces. Victor Crane, the celebrated novelist whose star had been dimmed by Clara's rise, was a figure of particular interest. His charm, so evident during the salon, had a practised quality, and Miss Marple sensed a depth of feeling beneath it, perhaps resentment, perhaps something darker. She had arranged to speak with him, using her unassuming demeanour to her advantage. A polite request, framed as a desire to discuss his latest novel, had been enough to secure a private moment. Victor agreed readily, perhaps relieved to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the drawing-room, and they met in a small study adjacent to the library, its walls lined with maps and old prints of the Manor's estate. A fire burned low in the grate, and Victor stood by it, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, his dark hair catching the light as he turned to greet her. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm but tinged with fatigue. "I'm flattered by your interest in my work, though I confess this isn't the setting I'd have chosen for a literary chat." His smile was disarming, but Miss Marple noted the faint lines of tension around his eyes, the way his hands clasped and unclasped before settling on the mantelpiece. "Oh, I quite understand, Mr. Crane," she replied, settling into a chair with her knitting. "It's a dreadful business, and I shan't keep you long. I've so enjoyed your novels, such depth of character. But I couldn't help overhearing last night that Miss Wren's work was quite different from yours. It must be fascinating, being part of such a vibrant literary world, though I imagine it can be competitive." Victor's smile faltered, just for a moment, and he turned to face the fire, his fingers tracing the edge of his signet ring. "Competitive is putting it mildly," he said, his tone light but with an edge. Clara was a force, no question. Her style, modern, experimental, it caught the public's fancy. Some called it revolutionary, others thought it a passing fad. Either way, it made waves. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a soothing counterpoint to the tension in his voice. "And you, Mr. Crane? Did you find her work revolutionary?" Her question was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. watching for any flicker of truth. He hesitated, then gave a short laugh. "I'll be honest, Miss Marple. I didn't care for it. Too fragmented, too self-conscious. My story is aimed at transport, to tell a tale that endures. Clara's were, well, they were about her, if you know what I mean. But she had talent, and the critics loved her. Or most of them did." His voice hardened slightly on the last words, and Miss Marple noted the subtle shift. "You mean Mr. Slate, perhaps?" she said, her tone as mild as if she were discussing the weather. "I understand he was rather harsh in his review of her work." Victor's jaw tightened, and he turned to face her, his eyes searching hers as though gauging her intent. "Harsh is an understatement. Slate tore her novel to shreds, called it pretentious nonsense. I saw the review in the Literary Gazette. Clara was livid, said it was personal, not professional. She wasn't wrong either. Slate's got a reputation for settling scores with his pen." He paused, then added, "Not that I'm one to talk. The literary world's a battlefield, and we all take our hits." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of sympathetic understanding. "It must be difficult seeing a newcomer rise so quickly. I've heard Miss Wren's success was quite the talk of London. Did it ever feel unfair, perhaps?" Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, but he answered with a shrug. "Unfair? No, I wouldn't say that. Success comes and goes. Clara had her moment, and I've had mine. But I won't lie, it stings when the spotlight shifts. Her books were outselling mine, and publishers were buzzing about her next project. A memoir, they said, full of secrets." His voice took on a bitter edge, and he caught himself, forcing a smile. "But that's the game, isn't it? You keep writing, keep fighting." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she tilted her head, her gaze soft but piercing. "A memoir sounds intriguing. Did you know much about it? I imagine it caused quite a stir among your circle." Victor hesitated, his fingers resuming their restless twisting of the ring. "Only what I heard in passing. Clara wasn't shy about it. She said it would shake things up. I didn't pay much attention, to be honest. I was too busy with my own work." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, as though the mention of the memoir touched a nerve. She shifted tack, her voice as gentle as ever. "You were near the sideboard last night, weren't you? Before the toast, I mean. I recall you speaking with Dr. Mortimer, not far from where the drinks were poured." Victor's hand stilled, and he met her gaze, his expression guarded. "I suppose I was," he said carefully. "The room was crowded, and I was mingling like everyone else. I took a glass of brandy when Jenkins offered it. I didn't notice anything unusual." His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the slight quickening of his breath, the way his eyes flicked toward the door. "Of course," she said, her smile reassuring. "It's so easy to miss things in a busy room. I find it's often the smallest details that slip by, yet they can mean so much." She paused, then added, "You were reading from your new novel before the toast, weren't you?" Such a commanding presence. I imagine it held everyone's attention. Victor relaxed slightly, his charm reasserting itself. "You're kind to say so. I was reciting a passage from my latest draft, nothing published yet. It did seem to draw a crowd, though I'm not sure how many were listening." He chuckled, but the sound was hollow, and Miss Marple sensed he was steering the conversation away from the sideboard. She let the moment pass, thanking him for his time and rising to leave. As she gathered her knitting, she said almost as an afterthought, "It's curious, isn't it, how quickly things can change in a single evening. One moment, all is well, and the next, tragedy." Her eyes met his, and for a fleeting second she saw something, guilt, fear, or perhaps merely sorrow, before his smile returned. "Curious indeed," he said, escorting her to the door. "I hope the inspector finds answers soon, for Clara's sake." Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, her mind alive with new observations. Victor Crane's rivalry with Clara was no secret, and his proximity to the sideboard placed him in a position of opportunity. His mention of the memoir, and the unease it provoked, suggested he might have feared its contents, just as Slate did. Yet his alibi, reciting poetry in full view of the guests, seemed solid, unless he had found a way to slip away unnoticed. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a shopkeeper who appeared busy with customers, while secretly tampering with accounts. And she wondered if Victor's charm might conceal a similar sleight of hand. Settling back into her chair, her knitting resumed, Miss Marple turned her thoughts to the broader picture. The memoir loomed large, a potential key to Clara's death, but it was the human heart, its jealousies, its fears, that drove this crime. Victor's polished exterior hid a man under pressure, and pressure, she knew, could push even the most composed to desperate acts. As her needles clicked, she felt the puzzle drawing tighter, its pieces aligning, though the full pattern remained just out of reach. Chapter 8. A Clue in the Glass. The afternoon at Harrow Manor wore on with a heaviness that seemed to seep into the very walls, the grandeur of the house dulled by the pall of suspicion and grief. Miss Jane Marple, having returned to the drawing-room after her conversation with Victor Crane, resumed her place in the corner, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. The guests, still confined by Inspector Harroway's orders, drifted between restless conversation and uneasy silence, their glances darting toward the door where the inspector and his constables worked to unravel the mystery of Clara Wren's death. Miss Marple, however, was content to observe, her mind sifting through the fragments of information she had gathered, each one a thread in the intricate tapestry of the crime. The inspector's men had sealed the library, and the sideboard with its array of glasses and decanters was now under scrutiny. Miss Marple's thoughts kept returning to that fateful moment before the toast, when the poison had been slipped into Clara's glass. The faint, bitter almond scent she had detected lingered in her memory, a clue as certain as it was elusive. Cyanide, Dr. Langley had confirmed, was the likely cause, and its presence suggested a deliberate act, one requiring both access and intent. But the how and the who remained tantalizingly out of reach, hidden in the bustle of the salon's final moments. Miss Marple's opportunity to explore further came unexpectedly when Inspector Harroway, emerging from the study, requested her presence in the library. "Miss Marple," he said, his gruff voice softened by a touch of respect, "you've a reputation for noticing things others miss. I'd value your thoughts on the scene, if you'd be so kind." His invitation was not entirely surprising. Miss Marple had assisted in village matters before, her unassuming demeanour often coaxing truths that eluded official inquiries. She followed him to the library, her small figure dwarfed by the room's towering shelves and ornate chandelier. The scene was much as it had been the previous night. save for the absence of Clara's body, which had been removed to the local morgue for examination. The shattered glass still lay on the rug, cordoned off by a constable, and the sideboard stood untouched, its contents carefully labelled by the inspector's team. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, noting the fern that partially screened the sideboard, the scattered chairs where guests had stood, and the faint stain on the rug where Clara's wine had spilled. Inspector Harroway gestured to the sideboard. "We've taken samples from every glass and decanter," he said. "The lab will confirm, but Dr. Langley's certain it's cyanide. Fast-acting, deadly in small doses. The question is how it got into her glass, and only hers." He pointed to the broken shards. "That's where we found the strongest trace of the smell. No one else has shown symptoms, so it wasn't in the decanter." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze fixed on the sideboard. "A very precise act, Inspector," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It would have taken only a moment, wouldn't it? In a crowded room, with everyone moving about, a hand could slip something into a glass without being noticed." She stepped closer, careful not to disturb the scene, and examined the tray. The glasses, now neatly arranged for evidence, were identical, their stems delicate, and their bowls still bearing traces of wine or brandy. One, however, stood out. A single glass, slightly apart, with a faint residue that seemed to shimmer into light. She leaned forward, her nose catching that telltale almond-like scent, fainter now, but unmistakable. "This must be Miss Wren's," she said, more to herself than to the inspector. Her eyes moved to the rug where a small crumpled napkin lay near the base of the sideboard, overlooked in the initial sweep. It was monogrammed, its fine linen stained with a dark smudge that might have been wine or something more sinister. "Inspector," she said, pointing with her knitting needle, "might that napkin be of interest?" Harroway's brows rose, and he signalled to a constable to retrieve it. The young officer, gloved and careful, lifted the napkin and held it to the light. The stain was faint but distinct, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a trace of crystalline residue along its edge, barely visible but suggestive. "Could be nothing," the inspector said, "but we'll send it to the lab. Good eye, Miss Marple." She smiled modestly, stepping back. "It's often the little things, Inspector. In my village I once found a clue in a dropped handkerchief, quite revealing in the end." Her tone was light, but her mind was racing. The napkin, she suspected, had been used to wipe a vial or container, perhaps one that held the cyanide. Its presence near the sideboard placed it at the heart of the crime, and the monogram, a single elegant S, pointed to Edmund Slate, whose initials she had noted on his cufflinks the previous evening. As the constable bagged the napkin, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the mechanics of the act. The sideboard had been crowded, the fern offering a partial screen, but the poisoner would have needed to act swiftly, with no one noticing. She recalled the moments before the toast, Victor Crane near the sideboard, speaking with Dr. Mortimer, Slate, after his argument with Clara, lingering nearby, Lady Beatrice, moving among her guests but always aware of the room's pulse. Any of them could have seized the moment, but the napkin suggested Slate, whose motive, fear of Clara's memoir, was growing clearer. She turned to the inspector, her expression one of gentle inquiry. "Have you learned anything more about Miss Wren's memoir? I've heard whispers that it contained sensitive information." Harroway's jaw tightened. We're looking into it. Her publisher sent a note this morning. Says she'd submitted a partial draft, but it's locked in their safe. They're cagey about the contents, but there's talk it named names stirred up trouble. Could be why someone wanted her gone." He paused, then added, "You've heard something, haven't you?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Only what one picks up in conversation, Inspector. People talk, especially when they're nervous. It seems Miss Wren had a knack for making enemies, perhaps unintentionally." She left it at that, knowing the inspector would pursue the memoir's contents, but her own inquiries would take a different path. As they returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple's mind lingered on the napkin. Its monogram was a clue, but not yet proof. Slate's argument with Clara, his proximity to the sideboard, and now this damning piece of evidence pointed to him, but she knew better than to leap to conclusions. In St. Mary Mead, she had once misjudged a case involving a stolen brooch, assuming the obvious culprit only to find the truth lay elsewhere. The napkin could have been dropped by accident, or even planted to mislead. She would need to watch Slate closely, and the others too, for the truth often hid in the spaces between what was seen and what was said. Settling back into her chair, her knitting resumed, Miss Marple felt the puzzle tightening. The sideboard, the napkin, the memoir, each was a piece, and together they were beginning to form a picture. Clara Wren's death was a crime of precision, driven by fear or envy, and as her needles clicked, Miss Marple knew she was closer to the heart of it, though the final thread remained just out of reach. Chapter 9. The Critic's Mask. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the drawing-room of Harrow Manor, where the guests remained under the watchful eye of Inspector Harroway's constables. The air was thick with tension, the earlier attempts at conversation now reduced to whispers and uneasy glances. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner with her knitting bag at her side, appeared to be absorbed in her work, her needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the intensity of her thoughts. The discovery of the monogrammed napkin, with its faint crystalline residue and the telltale initial S, had sharpened her focus on Edmund Slate, the acerbic critic whose sharp pen and sharper tongue had made him a formidable figure in Clara Wren's world. Miss Marple knew that confronting a man like Slate required care. His detachment, so evident the previous evening, was a carefully crafted mask, one she had seen in others who hid their motives behind a veneer of indifference. In St. Mary Mead, she had once dealt with a village solicitor who used his dry wit to deflect suspicion, only to be undone by a single careless remark. Slate, she suspected, would be no less guarded, but she had a way of coaxing truths from even the most reticent souls. She found her opportunity when Slate, restless and isolated, stepped onto the terrace overlooking the manor's gardens. The day was overcast, the air damp with the promise of rain, and he stood alone, his thin frame hunched against the chill as he smoked a cigarette. Miss Marple, wrapping her shawl about her shoulders, joined him, her approach as unassuming as ever. "Mr. Slate," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I hope I'm not intruding. I find a breath of fresh air can do wonders for clearing the mind, don't you?" Slate turned, his hawk-like features tightening briefly before he forced a thin smile. "Miss Marple, isn't it? I'm not much for fresh air, but I needed a moment away from all this." He gestured vaguely toward the house, his cigarette glowing faintly as he took a drag. "It's a grim business, and I've no patience for being cooped up with a lot of nervous chatter." Miss Marple nodded, settling onto a stone bench nearby, her knitting bag at her side. "Quite understandable," she said. "It's a dreadful thing, losing Miss Wren so suddenly. Understand you knew her work well. Your reviews are quite celebrated after all." Her tone was admiring, but her eyes were keen, watching for any crack in his composure. Slate's smile turned sardonic. "Celebrated by some, despised by others. It's the critic's lot, Miss Marple. Clara's work was divisive. I gave it the appraisal it deserved, nothing more." His voice was cool, but there was a defensive edge to it, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened around the cigarette. "Oh, I'm sure you did," she said, her needles appearing as if by habit. "I heard your review of her novel was quite strong. Derivative drivel, I believe. Such vivid words. I imagine she took it rather personally." Her tone was gentle, almost conversational, but the question hung between them like a challenge. Slate's eyes narrowed, and he flicked ash into the wind. "She did," he said curtly. "Clara had a thin skin for someone so ambitious. She confronted me at a dinner in London, made a scene, accused me of bias. I told her the truth. Her work lacked originality, leaned too heavily on others' ideas. She didn't take kindly to that." He paused, his gaze hardening. "But if you're suggesting I had anything to do with her death, you're barking up the wrong tree." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression one of mild surprise. "Oh, dear me, no, Mr. Slate. I'm only trying to understand the poor girl. She sounds like someone who stirred strong feelings. I heard she was writing a memoir, something about secrets in the literary world. Did she ever mention it to you?" Slate's hand froze, the cigarette halfway to his lips. For a fleeting moment, his mask slipped, revealing a flash of fear in his eyes before he recovered. "Her memoir. I heard the rumors, like everyone else. Clara liked to talk big, said it would expose the truth, whatever that meant. I didn't take it seriously. She was always looking for attention." His voice was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the tremor in his fingers, the way his gaze darted toward the house. "How very interesting," she said, her tone as light as ever. "It must be unsettling, knowing someone might write about one's past. In my village, we had a woman who kept a diary. Such a fuss when it was found, full of little truths no one wanted aired." She smiled, as though sharing a harmless anecdote. But her words were calculated, probing for a reaction. Slate stubbed out his cigarette with more force than necessary. "If Clara had secrets, they weren't mine," he said sharply. "I've nothing to hide. My reviews speak for themselves, and if she thought she could ruin me with some half-baked memoir, she was mistaken." He turned to face her, his eyes cold. "She was a menace, Miss Marple, stirring up trouble wherever she went. But I didn't kill her. I was by the bookcase all evening, ask anyone." Miss Marple tilted her head, her shoo expression one of gentle concern. "Of course, Mr. Slate. It's only that I recall seeing you near the sideboard at one point, just before the toast. You were speaking with Miss Wren, weren't you? It looked rather heated." Slate's face paled, and his hands clenched at his sides. "You're mistaken," he said, his voice low and tight. "I was nowhere near the sideboard. I spoke to Clara briefly, yes, but it was nothing, just a disagreement about her work. I went back to the bookcase afterward. I had no reason to harm her." His words were firm, but Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow, the slight quiver in his voice. She nodded, as though satisfied, and returned to her knitting. "My eyes aren't what they used to be," she said with a small laugh. "It's so easy to misjudge things in a crowded room. Thank you for indulging an old woman's curiosity, Mr. Slate. I'm sure the inspector will sort it all out." Slate gave a curt nod and turned back to the garden, lighting another cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. Miss Marple rose, her shawl adjusted neatly, and made her way back to the drawing room, her mind alight with new insights. Slate's defensiveness, his insistence on his distance from the sideboard, and the fear in his eyes when she mentioned the memoir, all pointed to a man with something to hide. The monogrammed napkin, with its telltale S, loomed large in her thoughts, but she knew better than to assume guilt without further proof. In St. Mary Mead, she had once suspected a gardener of theft, only to find the true culprit was a seemingly innocent neighbour. Slate's guilt was plausible, but not certain. As she re-entered the drawing room, she caught sight of Victor Crane, who was speaking in low tones with Lady Beatrice. His charm was in full force, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes followed Slate's return from the terrace, a flicker of calculation in his gaze. Lady Beatrice, too, seemed tense, her hands fidgeting with her necklace as she listened to Victor. The other guests, Arthur Pennington, Dr. Mortimer, Mrs. Lavinia Gray, sat in scattered groups, their conversations muted, their eyes wary. Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together. The napkin, Slate's argument with Clara, the memoir's threat. But there was still the matter of opportunity, and the possibility that someone else had seized that fleeting moment by the sideboard. She thought of Victor's proximity, his rivalry with Clara, and Lady Beatrice's stake in her salon's reputation. Each had a motive, each had a chance, and the truth, she knew, lay in the delicate interplay of their actions and secrets. As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery drawing tighter. Slate's mask had cracked, revealing a man under pressure, but whether that pressure had driven him to murder remained to be seen. Her needles clicked, a quiet counterpoint to the storm brewing within Harrow Manor, and she knew that the next piece of the puzzle would bring her closer to the heart of Clara Wren's death. Chapter 10. The Puzzle Unfolds. The evening settled over Harrow Manor like a heavy curtain. The grey light of the overcast day giving way to a deepening dusk that seemed to mirror the growing unease within its walls. The drawing-room, where the guests remained under the watchful eye of Inspector Harroway's constables, was lit by the soft glow of lamps, their warm light doing little to dispel the chill of suspicion that hung in the air. Miss Jane Marple sat in her accustomed corner, her knitting needles moving with a quiet precision that belied the intensity of her thoughts. Her conversation with Edmund Slate had sharpened her focus, his defensive manner, and the monogrammed napkin pointing to a man with much to fear from Clara Wren's revelations. Yet Miss Marple knew that a single clue, however damning, was not enough. The truth required a careful weaving of motive, opportunity, and evidence, and she was determined to see the pattern through. The inspector's investigation had progressed through the day. with forensic experts arriving to collect samples from the library and interviews continuing in the study. Miss Marple, though not officially part of the inquiry, had been permitted to linger near the scenes of activity, her unassuming presence allowing her to overhear snippets of the constable's discussions. The lab had confirmed cyanide in Clara's glass, with traces detected on the monogrammed napkin, strengthening the case against Slate. Yet Miss Marple's mind, honed by years of unravelling village intrigues, was not content to settle on the obvious. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a stolen necklace had been pinned on a maid, only for the true thief to be revealed through a forgotten detail in a grocer's ledger. The napkin was compelling, but it could be a misdirection, and she needed to confirm the sequence of events that had led to Clara's death. To do so, she turned her attention to the timeline of the fatal evening, piecing together the moments before the toast. The library had been a whirl of activity, guests mingling, the butler distributing drinks, Lady Beatrice orchestrating the flow of conversation. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing the scene as she had observed it. Victor Crane, near the sideboard, had been speaking with Dr. Mortimer, his charm masking a restless energy. Edmund Slate, after his heated exchange with Clara, had lingered near the bookcase, but had been seen by the sideboard earlier, as Mrs. Gray had noted. Lady Beatrice, ever the attentive hostess, had moved through the crowd, her eyes on her guests, but perhaps not on the tray of glasses. The fern by the sideboard, Miss Marple recalled, had provided a partial screen, offering a fleeting window for the poisoner to act. She rose, her knitting tucked into her bag, and approached Inspector Harroway, who was conferring with a constable near the drawing-room door. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but clear, "might I have a word? I've been thinking about the sideboard, and I wonder if you've had a chance to map out who was where, just before the toast." Harroway, his weathered face creasing with curiosity, nodded. "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. We've got statements, but they're a bit muddled. Everyone was moving about. What's on your mind?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a quiet confidence. "It's just that in my village, I've found that reconstructing a moment can reveal things people don't realize they've seen. The sideboard was busy, but not everyone could have reached it without being noticed. I recall Mr. Slate near it after his talk with Miss Wren, and Mr. Crane was close by speaking with Dr. Mortimer. Perhaps if we could pinpoint their movements, it might clarify things." The inspector rubbed his chin, considering. "Fair point. We've got Jenkins's statement. He said he stepped away to fetch more brandy just before the toast, leaving the tray unattended for a minute or two. That's likely when it happened. Let's go over it again." He called for the butler, who appeared promptly, his formal demeanour unshaken despite the strain of the day. Jenkins, standing stiffly, recounted his actions. "I poured the drinks around 8:30, sir," he said. "Brandy, wine, sherry, all from the decanters on the sideboard. I served most of the guests, but I had to fetch another bottle from the cellar when the brandy ran low. I was gone perhaps 2 minutes, no more. When I returned, the tray was as I'd left it, and Lady Beatrice called for the toast soon after." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "And during those 2 minutes, Mr. Jenkins, Did you notice anyone lingering near the sideboard when you returned?" Jenkins frowned, his brow furrowing. "It's hard to say, madam. The room was crowded, and I was focused on my duties. I believe Mr. Crane was nearby, talking to the professor, and Mr. Slate was by the bookcase, though he'd been closer to the sideboard earlier. I didn't see anyone touch the tray, but I wasn't watching it every moment." Haraway nodded, making a note. "Right. We'll cross-check with the other statements. Miss Marple, anything else you'd suggest?" She hesitated, then said, "Only that the napkin we found might be telling. Its monogram S suggests a connection to Mr. Slate, but it's worth considering how it came to be there. Could someone have used it to mislead us, perhaps?" Her tone was mild, but her words carried weight, and the inspector's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. "We're testing the napkin for fingerprints, though the residue's already confirmed as cyanide. If it's Slate's, he's got some explaining to do." Miss Marple returned to her chair, her mind turning over the timeline. The 2-minute window when Jenkins was absent was critical. The poison had been added then, she was certain. Slate's presence near the sideboard, confirmed by multiple accounts, made him the most likely suspect, especially given his fear of Clara's memoir. Yet Victor Crane's proximity could not be ignored, nor could Lady Beatrice's access to the household stores. The memoir, with its promise of scandal, loomed large, but Miss Marple knew that motives could be layered, and she needed to ensure no thread was overlooked. She recalled her conversation with Slate, his trembling hands and defensive denial when she mentioned the memoir. His claim of staying by the bookcase was contradicted by Mrs. Gray's observation of him near the sideboard, and the napkin's monogram was a damning link. But Miss Marple's instincts, sharpened by years of village mysteries, urged caution. The napkin could have been dropped accidentally, or deliberately placed to incriminate Slate. In St. Mary Mead, she had once seen a forged letter used to cast blame, and she wondered if a similar deception was at play here. As she knitted, her thoughts turned to the other guests. Arthur Pennington, the young poet, had admired Clara, but seemed too timid for murder. Dr. Mortimer's pomposity suggested no deep grudge, though his knowledge of literature might hide a darker motive. Mrs. Gray, with her love of gossip, might know more than she let on, but her flustered demeanour suggested fear rather than guilt. Lady Beatrice, with her stake in the salon's reputation, remained a question mark. Her distress seemed genuine, but Miss Marple knew that appearances could deceive. The inspector re-entered the room, his expression grim. "We've got preliminary results," he announced to the gathered guests. "The napkin had cyanide traces, and it matches the set used by the household. We're checking for fingerprints, but it's a strong lead. I'll need to speak to Mr. Slate again." Slate, standing by the window, stiffened, his face paling. "This is absurd," he said, his voice sharp. "I've told you, I was nowhere near that tray. Someone's trying to frame me." His eyes darted to Victor Crane, who met his gaze with a cool, unreadable expression. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind crystallizing around a hypothesis. Slate's fear, the napkin, the timeline, all pointed to him, but the truth, she sensed, was a delicate balance. The poisoner had acted with precision, choosing a moment of distraction to strike. Slate's argument with Clara, his proximity to the sideboard, and the memoir's threat made him the prime suspect. but she needed one final piece to confirm her suspicions. As the guests murmured and the inspector prepared to question Slate, Miss Marple felt the puzzle nearing completion. The threads, motive, opportunity, evidence were aligning, and she knew that the next revelation would bring her to the heart of Clara Wren's murder. Chapter 11. The Confrontation. The library at Harrow Manor, once a haven of intellectual discourse, had become a stage for a grim reckoning. Inspector Harroway had gathered the guests and key suspects, Lady Beatrice Harrow, Victor Crane, Edmund Slate, and a handful of others, back in the room where Clara Wren had met her tragic end. The chandeliers cast their familiar glow, but the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, the air taut as a drawn bowstring. Miss Jane Marple stood quietly near the back, her small figure almost lost among the taller guests, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. Her pale eyes, sharp and unclouded, moved from face to face, cataloguing the subtle signs of tension that betrayed the secrets each carried. Inspector Harroway stood by the sideboard, now cleared of its glasses and decanters, which had been sent for forensic analysis. His weathered face was set in a determined line, his notebook clutched in one hand as he addressed the room. "We've made progress," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "The lab confirms cyanide in Miss Wren's glass, with traces on a napkin found nearby. We've also got statements placing certain individuals near the sideboard before the toast. It's time to lay the facts bare." Miss Marple, her hands still but her mind racing, had spent the day piecing together the puzzle. The monogrammed napkin with its S initial, the timeline of the toast and the whispers of Clara's memoir had all pointed to Edmund Slate, whose fear of exposure seemed a compelling motive. Yet she knew from her St. Mary Mead days that the obvious answer was not always the true one. Her conversations with Victor Crane, Lady Beatrice and Slate himself had revealed layers of envy, ambition, and hidden grudges, and she had formed a hypothesis that she now felt ready to test. Harroway turned to Slate, who stood by the bookcase, his thin frame rigid, his hawk-like features pale but defiant. "Mr. Slate," the inspector said, "you were seen near the sideboard before the toast after a heated exchange with Miss Wren. The napkin we found, monogrammed with your initial, had cyanide residue. Care to explain?" Slate's eyes flashed, and he stepped forward, his voice sharp. "I've told you. I was by the bookcase during the toast. That napkin proves nothing. It could belong to anyone. Someone's trying to pin this on me, and I won't stand for it." His gaze darted to Victor Crane, who stood near the hearth, his expression cool and unreadable. Miss Marple cleared her throat, her voice soft but carrying the weight of certainty. "If I may, Inspector," she said, stepping forward with a modesty that belied her intent. "I've been thinking about that napkin, and it's true, it could belong to anyone. But it's the timing that interests me. The poison was added just before the toast when the sideboard was briefly unattended. Mr. Slate, you were seen near it after your conversation with Miss Wren. Mrs. Gray mentioned it, and Lady Beatrice confirmed you were there earlier." Slate's face darkened, but Miss Marple continued, her tone as gentle as if she were discussing village gossip. "Miss Wren, I understand, was writing a memoir that threatened to expose a secret from your past. A plagiarism scandal, perhaps, from your early days as a critic. Such a revelation would ruin your reputation, wouldn't it? The room went still, the guest's eyes fixed on Slate. His hands trembled, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Miss Marple pressed on, her voice steady. "You argued with her that evening near the sideboard. She threatened to reveal the truth, and you saw your chance when Jenkins stepped away to fetch more brandy. It was a matter of seconds to slip the cyanide into her glass, wasn't it? The fern provided cover, and the crowd was distracted. Then you dropped the napkin, perhaps by accident, perhaps to wipe your hands, leaving it to be found." Slate's composure cracked, his face contorting with a mix of fear and fury. "This is preposterous," he spat. "I didn't touch her glass. Yes, we argued. She was a reckless fool, threatening me with lies about some old misunderstanding. But I didn't kill her. I'd never—" He stopped, his breath ragged, as though realizing he had said too much. Inspector Harroway's eyes narrowed. "A misunderstanding, you say? Care to elaborate, Mr. Slate?" Slate's shoulders slumped, and he ran a hand through his thinning hair. "It was years ago," he said, his voice low. "I borrowed some ideas for a review when I was starting out. Clara found out somehow, threatened to put it in her memoir. It would have ended me, but I swear, I didn't kill her. I was angry, yes, but I went back to the bookcase after our argument. Ask anyone." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle skepticism. "But you were seen near the sideboard, Mr. Slate, and the napkin bears your initial. It's curious, isn't it, how such a small thing can point so clearly? In my village, I once found a lost button that led to a thief. It's often the little things that betray us." Victor Crane, who had been silent, spoke up, his voice smooth but edged with tension. "Miss Marple, you're quick to accuse, but what about the rest of us? I was near the sideboard too, talking to Dr. Mortimer. Anyone could have dropped that napkin, or planted it." His eyes met Slate's, a flicker of challenge in them, and Miss Marple noted the subtle shift in his demeanour, as though he were testing the waters. Lady Beatrice, standing near the fire, clasped her hands tightly. "This is dreadful," she said, her voice trembling. "Edmund, surely you couldn't— I mean, Clara was difficult, but murder?" Her distress seemed genuine, but Miss Marple caught the way her eyes darted to Victor, as though seeking reassurance. The inspector, sensing the moment, stepped forward. "We've got fingerprints on the napkin," he said, his voice firm. "They match yours, Mr. Slate. And we found a vial in your coat pocket, empty, but with traces of cyanide. Care to explain that?" Slate's face went ashen, and he staggered back, his hands raised as though to ward off the accusation. "No," he whispered, "that's impossible. I didn't— Someone must have put it there." His voice rose, desperate now, and the guests gasped, their eyes wide with shock. Miss Marple's needles, which she had retrieved during the confrontation, paused. She had suspected Slate, but the vial was a surprise, a piece that fit too neatly. She thought of Saint Mary Mead, where a planted letter had once misled a village inquiry, and wondered if someone had orchestrated this to ensure Slate's downfall. Yet the evidence— the napkin, the fingerprints, the vial— was overwhelming, and Slate's own admission of Clara's threat sealed his motive. "I didn't mean to," Slate said suddenly, his voice breaking. "She was going to ruin me. Everything I'd built, I had the cyanide. Yes, from an old chemistry set I kept for experiments. I only meant to scare her, but when she kept pushing, threatening me in front of everyone, I saw the glass, and it was so easy. Just a pinch. While Jenkins was gone, I didn't think it would work so fast." He sank into a chair, his head in his hands, as the room erupted in murmurs. Inspector Harroway signalled to his constables, who moved to flank Slate. "Edmund Slate, you're under arrest for the murder of Clara Wren," he said, his voice steady. "You'll come with us." Miss Marple watched as Slate was led away, his defiance gone, replaced by a hollow resignation. The guests dispersed, their voices low with shock and relief, but Miss Marple remained, her mind still turning over the puzzle. Slate's confession fit the evidence, yet something nagged at her. A sense that the solution was too tidy, the vial too convenient. But for now, the case was closed, and she had no further proof to challenge it. As she gathered her knitting, she felt the weight of the truth settle over her. Clara Wren's death had been a crime of fear, born of a man's desperation to protect his fragile reputation. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen such fears drive people to ruin. And here, in the grand setting of Harrow Manor, the human heart had proved no less frail. Chapter 12. The Quiet Departure. The morning following Edmund Slate's arrest dawned with a fragile clarity, the clouds that had shrouded Harrow Manor giving way to a pale sun that cast tentative rays across the estate. The grandeur of the house, with its towering stone facade and manicured gardens, seemed to regain a measure of its dignity, as though relieved of the dark secret that had stained its walls. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the dear drawing-room with her knitting bag at her side, sipped a cup of tea, her eyes lingering on the distant hills visible through the tall windows. The guests, no longer confined by the inspector's orders, were preparing to depart, their voices subdued but tinged with relief. Yet Miss Marple's mind, ever restless when a puzzle was solved, turned over the events of the past days, seeking any loose thread that might unravel her satisfaction. The case, to all appearances, was closed. Slate's confession, his admission to slipping cyanide into Clara Wren's glass out of fear for his reputation, had been corroborated by the evidence. The monogrammed napkin, the fingerprints, the vial found in his pocket. Inspector Harroway, efficient and thorough, had expressed his gratitude to Miss Marple for her keen observations, particularly the discovery of the napkin, which had turned the tide of the investigation. Yet, as she knitted, her needles moving with their familiar rhythm, Miss Marple felt a faint unease, a whisper of doubt that lingered like a shadow. The solution was tidy, perhaps too tidy, and she knew from her St. Mary Mead days that truth often hid in the overlooked corners of a case. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her composure restored, though her eyes still bore the strain of the ordeal, approached Miss Marple with a warm smile. "Miss Marple," she said, settling into a chair opposite, "I cannot thank you enough for your help. This dreadful business might have ruined my salon, but your insight, well, it's given us a chance to move forward. I do hope you'll stay a few days longer. Let me show you the gardens or the village. It's the least I can do." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with kindness, but she shook her head gently. "You're very kind, Lady Beatrice, but my roses in St. Mary Mead are calling me home. They've a way of getting neglected when I'm away, and I find a garden can be quite unforgiving." Her tone was light, but her gaze was sharp, noting the faint relief in Lady Beatrice's expression, as though the departure of her guests would close the chapter on this tragedy. "I understand," Lady Beatrice said, her voice softening, "but you've left us with a debt we can never repay. To think it was Edmund, I still can't quite believe it." She paused, her fingers smoothing the folds of her dress, a gesture Miss Marple had come to recognize as a sign of her unease. "It is surprising," Miss Marple agreed, her needles pausing. "Mr. Slate seemed so controlled, didn't he? But fear can drive even the most composed to desperate acts. Miss Wren's memoir must have been a great threat to him." She watched Lady Beatrice closely, noting the slight tightening of her lips at the mention of the memoir. "Yes, that dreadful book," Lady Beatrice said, her voice low. "I heard it was to be full of scandal. Perhaps it's best it never sees the light of day." She rose, offering a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and excused herself to attend to the departing guests. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the memoir, which had loomed over the case like a spectre. Its contents, still locked away in the publisher's safe, remained a mystery, but its mere existence had been enough to push Slate to murder. Or so it seemed. She recalled her conversation with Victor Crane, his guarded unease when the memoir was mentioned, and Lady Beatrice's own anxiety about her salon's reputation. Each had a stake in Clara's silence, yet only Slate had been caught by the evidence. As she packed her small suitcase, Miss Marple's mind turned to the vial found in Slate's pocket, a detail that had sealed his fate but troubled her still. It was too convenient, too neatly aligned with the napkin and fingerprints. In St. Mary Mead, she had once uncovered a plot where a stolen watch was planted to incriminate a rival, and she wondered if a similar deception had played out here. Yet Slate's confession, wrung from him in the heat of confrontation, had been unequivocal, and without further evidence, her doubts remained mere speculation. She joined the other guests in the hall, where Victor Crane was bidding farewell to Lady Beatrice, his charm as polished as ever. "A tragic end to a fine evening," he said, his voice warm but measured. "But your salon will endure, Lady Beatrice. Clara would have wanted that." His eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, and she caught a flicker of something, gratitude perhaps or relief, that gave her pause. Arthur Pennington, the young poet, hovered nearby, his face still pale but his manner less shaken. "Miss Marple," he said shyly, approaching her, "I wanted to thank you. You saw what we didn't, about Mr. Slate, I mean. Clara deserved justice." Miss Marple smiled, patting his arm. "You're very kind, Mr. Pennington. It's only a matter of noticing the little things, you know. People are much the same, whether in a village or a grand manor." Her words were gentle, but her mind was still turning, weighing the possibility that she had missed a detail, a final piece that would quiet her unease. As the hired car arrived to take her to the station, Miss Marple took one last look at Harrow Manor, its stone facade gleaming in the morning light. The guests dispersed, their lives resuming, but the shadow of Clara's death would linger, a reminder of the fragility of ambition and the darkness it could unleash. She boarded the train, her knitting bag settled beside her, and as the countryside rolled past, her needles resumed their rhythm, a counterpoint to the complexities of human nature she had unravelled. Back in St. Mary Mead, her roses would be waiting, and the quiet routines of village life would reclaim her. Yet Miss Marple knew that the puzzle of Harrow Manor would stay with her, its threads woven into the fabric of her memory. For now, the truth had been found, and justice served, but she would keep her eyes open, as always, for the small overlooked details that so often held the key to the heart's darkest secrets.